Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you for being here this afternoon and for being connected on the internet. Today we continue with a special Shabbat. It's a double Shabbat. Last night we had the weekly Shabbat and the last day of Unleavened Bread, which is the seventh day, and that is also a Shabbat. So we're still having a double blessing today until sunset. So tonight, the portions that we're going to be reading are not the regular Torah portions, but the readings associated with the seventh day of unleavened bread. Okay, so but before we do that, I'm going to start with the blessing. And it says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with your commandments and commanded us to engage ourselves in the words of the Torah. Amen. So the portions that we will be reading are from Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 through chapter 15, verse 26. Again, Exodus chapter 13, verse 17 through 15, verse 26. And then we'll be reading from the book of Numbers, chapter 28, verses 16 through 25. Now, the important thing about the seventh day of unleavened bread, besides it being a Shabbat, according to tradition, this is the day that the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea. Okay, exactly 7 days from Pesach, from the day they celebrated Passover in Egypt, to the moment that they crossed the sea. It was on the seventh day of unleavened bread. And as I was saying last night, the important thing about these festivals, about these days, about Shabbat, is that the understanding is that when we come into this sphere, into this dimension of holiness, it also embraces the first time that these things occurred. For example, the first time that when they crossed the Red Sea, the blessings and the miracles and all the awesome things that the Lord did for them during that day also is available for us when we celebrate the festivals of the Lord and when we celebrate Shabbat. So in a way, we go into this spiritual dimension of all these blessings. So I'm going to start reading from chapter 14 of Exodus. If you can please go to Exodus chapter 14. I want to start reading from there. And this is when they crossed the Red Sea. And it says, and I'm going to be using the Tree of Life scriptures. It says, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel so that they turn back and encamp before Pi Hahirot, between Migdol and the sea. You are to camp by the sea opposite Baal Zephon. Now, one of the things that the commentary says is that the Lord told the children of Israel to kind of go back, like if they were going back towards Egypt, to make believe that they were returning to Egypt. So Pharaoh would think that they were, because if you remember, when Pharaoh and Moses were having the discussion, at one point Moses said that they just wanted 3 days to go to worship the Lord in the desert, right? True. But we know that really they were not going to return. So the Lord says, go back and let's make believe that you're returning. So Pharaoh thinks that you are going back. So in verse 3 says, Pharaoh will say concerning the children of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. I will harden Pharaoh's heart so he will follow after them. Then I will be glorified over Pharaoh along with all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am Adonai. So they did so. So that was the reason, to kind of lure Pharaoh to come after them. So they went back, stayed there a little bit. And so now what they have is the Egyptians behind them and in front of them, the Red Sea. Verse 5, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart toward the people, and they said, what is this we have done that we let Israel go from serving us? Because you have to remember that Israel were slaves, and so that was their labor, okay, free labor. So he prepared his chariots and took his people with him. He took 600 of the finest chariots along with all other chariots of Egypt and captains over them. Adonai hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so he pursued the children of Israel, for the children of Israel went out with a high hand. But the Egyptians pursued them with all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, as well as his charioteers and his army, and overtook them as they were encamped by the sea, beside Pi-hahirot, opposite Baal Zephon. When Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. So they were terrified, and the children of Israel cried out to Adonai. They said to Moses, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness because there were no graves in Egypt? Why have you dealt this way with us to bring us out of Egypt? Did we not say to you in Egypt, let us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians? It was better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. So see how the perspective changes, because when they were in Egypt, they were complaining and crying out because of the servitude and of the oppression and the cruelty of the Egyptians towards them. So now they're saying it would have been better if we had stayed over there. So again, the perspective changes. But in verses 13 and 14, I need you to underline those verses, because today those verses are for us. Because remember that by celebrating in the time that the Lord wants us to celebrate, we also participate of the blessings of this first time when the children of Israel crossed the sea. So therefore, we're into this dimension. We're transcending time and receiving also the blessings. And verse 13 and 14 say, but Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of Adonai, which he will perform for you today. You have seen the Egyptians today, but you will never see them again, ever. Adonai will fight for you while you hold your peace. So whatever in your life is the Egyptian, these words are for you today. You need to understand that it is the Lord who fights for you. It is the Lord who stands for you, that no enemy can come against you. So therefore, these words are for you today. Then Adonai said to Moses, why are you crying to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. Then the children of Israel will go into the midst of the sea on dry ground. Then behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they will go in after them, so that I will be glorified over Pharaoh and all his army, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians will know that I am Adonai when I have been glorified over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And also you have to remember that what's called the trial of waters, or trials through waters, that it was during this time in the ancient Near East, sometimes a form that they judged the people was they were thrown into the waters, and if they survived, that meant they were innocent. So here the children of Israel are not only crossing through the waters, but they're also crossing on dry land through the waters, and we know that they make it to the other side. Therefore, that is a sign that they were innocent. Verse 19, then the messenger of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. Also, the pillar of cloud moved from in front and stood behind them, and so came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. There was the cloud and the darkness over here, yet it gave light by night over there. Neither one came near the other all night long. That's another thing, that for your enemies, they see darkness, but in your life, you're seeing light, because you're seeing the light of Messiah. He's the one standing there for you. Okay.
Yeah.
Verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. Adonai drove the sea back with a strong east wind throughout the night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided. Then the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, while the waters were like walls to them on their right and on their left. But the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Now it came about during the morning watch that Adonai looked at the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and caused the army of the Egyptians to panic. He took off their chariot wheels and caused them to drive heavily, so that the Egyptians said, get away from the presence of Israel, for Adonai fights for them against the Egyptians. That's another thing. We have to act in a way that when our enemies look at us, they can say, her God is fighting for her. His God is fighting for him. So that depends on how we respond to the presence of the Lord in our lives. Our enemies have to recognize who is fighting for us. Then Adonai said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters come back upon the Egyptians, over their chariots and their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the waters, and the sea returned to its strength at the break of dawn. The Egyptians were fleeing from it, but Adonai overthrew them in the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and the entire army of Pharaoh that went after them into the sea. Not one of them remained. That was a sign that they were guilty, because they did not make it out of the waters. So the trials made Israel innocent of what they had been judged against, that they were against Pharaoh. And now Pharaoh, who really was the one against Israel, dies in the waters. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were like walls to them on their right hand and on their left. Now you have to remember that also waters represent the Torah. Torah has to be on your right side and on your left side. Torah has to be surrounding you like walls to protect you. So Adonai saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great work that Adonai did over the Egyptians, the people feared Adonai, and they believed in Adonai and in his servant Moses. Chapter 15. Then Moses and the children of Israel sang this song to Adonai. Now it's interesting that the word sang here in Hebrew represents both the present and the future. The verb is written in such a manner that can be interpreted as being singing in the present and singing in the future. And we're going to see that later on, where this song again will be sung. And another thing is that we have to recognize that this song is a song of thanksgiving for the redemption and the salvation that the Lord did upon the children of Israel. It's not a song to be happy because the Egyptians died, because we also have to recognize that to our Heavenly Father, even the death of the wicked is not pleasant for him. So even our enemies, we have to pray for enemies like Yeshua taught us. Why? Because God doesn't want the death of anybody. God wants that people to live with him forever. So even our enemies, we have to pray for them that at some point they come to the knowledge of salvation through Messiah Yeshua. So the song is not about the death of the Egyptians, but about salvation and redemption that the Lord did for the children of Israel. So it says, I will sing to Adonai, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. Adonai is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will glorify him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. Adonai is a warrior. Adonai is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea, and his chosen captains have sunk into the sea of reeds. The deeps covered them, they sank to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Adonai, is glorious in power. Your right hand, Adonai, dashes the enemy to pieces. In the greatness of your excellency, you overthrow those who resist you. You send forth your wrath, it consumes them as stubble. With the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The flood stood upright as a heap. The deeps became firm ground in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My lust shall gorge on them. I will draw my sword, my hand will destroy them. But we know that all of that was the opposite. It was to the enemy that all these things happened and not to Israel. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, Adonai? Mika mocha among the gods. Who is like you, glorious in holiness, awesome in praises, doing wonders? We recite this every single Shabbat when we're doing the Shabbat service, the Shabbat prayers. You stretch out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. You in your loving kindness led the people you have redeemed. Now the word loving kindness in Hebrew there is the word chesed, chesed. And you have to remember that chesed means the faithfulness and loyalty of God to his covenant. Again, chesed is the faithfulness and loyalty of God to his covenant. So therefore, we can read it as you in your faithfulness and loyalty to your covenant, led the people you have redeemed. You guided them in your strength to your holy habitation. Now we know that they're just crossing at this moment the Red Sea, but he talks about that he's bringing them to their holy habit, to his holy habitation. Why? Because he's referring to the future, referring that they will come to Mount Zion, they will come to Mount Moriah, where the temple is going to be built. Why? Because that is the place where he wants to dwell with his people. When the peoples hear, they will tremble. Anguish will seize the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom are terrified. Trembling grips Moab's mighty men. All of Canaan's inhabitants will melt away. So these are the enemies that are mentioned, enemies of Israel, that they will fear because of all the great things that the Lord has done and will continue to do in favor of Israel. Verse 16 of chapter 15 of Exodus. Terror and dread will fall on them. By the greatness of your arm, they become still as a stone, till your people cross over, Adonai, till the people whom you purchased crossed over. You bring them in and plant them. And the term planting there means permanency. He wants to bring them to the land so they stay permanently in the land. In the mountain of your inheritance, Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, where the temple is to be built, the place, Hamakom, Adonai, that you have made for yourself to dwell in. The sanctuary, the Mikdash, Adonai, which your hands have prepared, Adonai will reign forever and ever. Again, the importance of the temple, the importance of Mount Zion, the importance of this place, because it's the place of his dwelling. Remember that the purpose of the Lord has always been to dwell with his people. So by bringing the children out of Israel, out of Egypt, to bring them to the land is because he wants to dwell with them in the land, his dwelling place. And not only that, where it says Adonai will reign forever and ever, this song really is an enthronement song. It's speaking about Hashem as sovereign king of all the earth, of all the universe. It's a song of kingship. Okay. Verse 19, for Pharaoh's horses with his chariots and his horsemen went into the sea, but Adonai brought the waters of the sea back over them. Yet the children of Israel walked in the midst of the sea on dry ground. Then Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing, as Miriam sang to them. Sing to Adonai, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. So again, this is the day that this happened, on the seventh day of unleavened bread. Go with me to Numbers chapter 28, the book of Numbers chapter 28, verses 16 through 25. Because here we're going to see the offerings that had to be brought on the seventh day during the week of unleavened bread, the whole 7 days. So verse 16 of chapter 28 of Numbers says, on the 14th day of the first month is Adonai's Passover. We have to remember that the first month is Aviv or Nisan. Okay, Aviv or Nisan, the first day, which is the first day of the biblical New Year. It says on the 15th day, there is to be a feast for 7 days. Unleavened bread will be eaten. So we have Pesach on the 14th of Nisan or Aviv. And then on the 15th, we have the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, so the first day, it says, on the 15th day, there is to be a feast. For 7 days, unleavened bread will be eaten. You are to hold a sacred assembly on the first day, which means to have a Shabbat. You are not to do any laborious work. You are to offer to Adonai burnt offering by fire, 2 young bulls, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs a year old. They are to be flawless. Verse 20, chapter 28 of Numbers. You are to offer their grain offering of fine flour mixed with oil, 3/10 of an ephah per bull, 2/10 per ram, and 1/10 per each of the 7 lambs, plus 1 goat for a purification offering to atone for yourselves. In addition to the morning burnt offering and regular burnt offering, you are to offer these. In other words, every day you have to remember that 2 lambs were offered, one in the morning and one in the evening. That is the Tamid offering. Besides that, all these other things had to be offered during the week of unleavened bread for 7 days. All these other things had to be brought to the temple. Verse 24, just like this, you are to offer each day for 7 days the food to be offered by fire for each day as a pleasing aroma to Adonai, beside the regular burnt offering with its drink offering. On the 7th day, you are to have a sacred assembly, Shabbat, and you are to do no laborious work. So here it's explaining to us the further offerings that had to be brought during the whole week of unleavened bread. And the first day, which is the 15th of Nisan, and the 7th day, which is today, is the 21st day of Nisan in the Hebrew calendar, is also a Shabbat. Okay, so we have to remember. Now, you might see in some of your calendars that it gives you an 8th day. The 8th day was added by the rabbis for people outside of Israel, for the diaspora, what they call the diaspora. People that are not living in Israel usually celebrate an extra day of a festival wherever they're at. But that is a designation given by the rabbis, as a rabbinical order, is not in the Torah. Okay, so, but I follow the way they do it in Israel. So tonight at sunset, we finish with unleavened bread. So you can go back to your bread and your pizza and all those things you want.
I have the same calendar, so.
Yeah. Okay. And so I had mentioned about the Song of Moses that, remember that I said the verbs means present and future. Well, let's see where they're going to sing that again. Please go to the book of Revelation, chapter 15. Revelation chapter 15. Now remember that we read the Song of Moses in Exodus chapter 15, and here now in chapter 15 of Revelation, we're going to read the following, and we're going to see how this relates to Yeshua. So again, Revelation, chapter 15, verses 1 through 4. And it says, then I saw another great and wonderful sign in heaven, 7 messengers who have 7 plagues, the last ones, for with them God's wrath is finished. And I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire. Now, it's not really glass. It's just that the water's so clear and so pure, is almost like looking at glass. But this one is mixed with fire. And those who had overcome the beast and his image and the number of his name, standing by the sea of glass, holding the harps of God. Now, one thing that you need to understand is when it talks about the number of his name, this is based on what's called in Judaism gematria. Gematria. And what is gematria? Gematria is a way of studying the Torah. It's another way of studying the Torah. And it has to do with numbers. As you already know, every single letter, Hebrew letter, has a numerical value, right? Mm-hmm. So what they do is they add the numbers, the total numbers of all the letters. And so that word is going to have a number. And based on that number, they're going to associate all the words that have that same numbers, that same numerical value. And they make associations with that. And so they make interpretations based on that. For example, the term nachash in Hebrew is what we translate as serpent. It so happens that the name Mashiach has the same numerical value as Nachash, which I think is 358. So what association do we see between a serpent and Messiah? Do you remember in Exodus when Moses took the rod that had the snake on it? Mm-hmm. And people that looked at it were healed from the fiery serpents that were bitten, and so they wouldn't die. They would look at the stake with the serpent. And Yeshua said, the same way that Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so will be the Son of Man lifted up. Okay, so there we see the association between Nachash, serpent, and Mashiach, the Messiah. And that is based on gematria, the numerical value of words. Okay, so that is a way of studying Torah. So when here in Revelation, the person that's writing Revelation, John, knows gematria. So that's why he says, and the number of his name, which as we read before in Revelation is the number 666. Now people have made up stories about the 666, and it's the simplest thing. And the only way you can figure out who is the 666 if you know gematria, and only in Hebrew. So when you take those three sixes in gematria in Hebrew, it turns out to be Nero, the Caesar Nero. So it's Nero who is the beast during this time when the Romans are dominating Israel and they're persecuting the believers of Messiah. And John is writing in codes. Why is he writing in codes? Because if any Roman took up this letter and read it, a whole bunch of heads would be rolling, okay? Because it was speaking against the government. So the only way you can understand that the book of Revelation is not to be taken out of its context. You have to read it based in the time that it was written and the reasons for it was written. Because by not doing that, we have come up with such foolish understanding that all it does is bring confusion to the body of Messiah. So therefore, Nero is the beast during that time. But what happens, speaking about that a people are victorious over all this, it says in verse 3, and they are singing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. So that song that we just read in Exodus 15 will be sung again. And why do they associate the Lamb with the song of Moses? Because we have to remember, people during this time that read this understood that it was speaking about the Exodus. It was speaking about the salvation that God brought to the people of Israel by taking them out of Egypt. And what did God use to redeem the people? The blood of a lamb. And who's that lamb? Messiah Yeshua. Remember, this has nothing to do with sin. It has to do with redemption. It has to do with bringing back a people unto God, giving them again their identity and building up the kingdom. It's not about sin, people. It's about relationship. So that's why when they mention the Song of Moses, the first thing you have to think about is redemption. Redemption, because the redemption started out in Exodus, and the Song of the Lamb is telling you that now we've come to the final redemption, to the end of redemption, to the end of the cycle. The cycle of redemption that first started in the Exodus has been finally finalized through Messiah Yeshua. That's why they're singing the Song of Moses and the Song of the Lamb. That's the only way you can associate it. But if you do not read, like a lot of people just read the New Testament and they don't read the Hebrew scriptures, you will not know what they're talking about here. What Song of Moses? The Song of Moses is in reference to Exodus 15. The only way you can make that relationship, that association between redemption, the first redemption and the final redemption, is if you know what happened in Exodus. And what are they saying? Great and wonderful are your deeds, Adonai Elohei Tsevaot. Just and true are your ways, O King of the nations. Who shall not fear and glorify your name, O Lord? For you alone are holy. All the nations shall come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. The purpose is for all nations to recognize that God is the only sovereign king in the heavens and on the earth. So that's why they're singing this. That's why they have this victory. They have come to the final redemption that we have only through Messiah Yeshua. That is why the connection between the Song of Moses and the Song of the Lamb. That's the connection between Passover. That's the connection. It's all about redemption. It's all about bringing back a people into relationship with the God of heaven and earth. Okay. So One thing that the commentaries say that, for example, since last night, most Jews spend the night studying Torah and the prophets and the writings and some of portions of the Midrash, of the Talmud, of the Zohar. Why? Because they believe that by reading the scriptures and reading all this literature, it brings forth what's called tikkun. And tikkun is rectification, bringing back rectification into our lives, bringing rectification to the earth. So therefore, by studying the Torah, studying the words of the Lord, studying his ways, we bring tikkun, rectification, to ourselves, to our families, to the whole world. So till tonight, sunset, we're still in the seventh day of unleavened bread. And again, the main theme of all this, and it's going to continue until Shavuot, is redemption. And redemption, the purpose is relationship. Okay. So basically, that was all the readings for today in terms of the seventh day of unleavened bread. So we're going to take some time for any questions that you might have.